Johnny Depp, one of America's most iconic actors, walked into a seemingly ordinary coffee shop, only to find himself embroiled in an unexpected and intense confrontation. What unfolded next uncovered startling revelations and set in motion a chain of events with profound and unforgettable consequences. Let us know where you're watching from. If you admire the righteous characters in this story, thumbs up and subscribe now. On a chilly early spring morning, Sofia, now 70 years old, strolled down the familiar streets of her neighborhood. The crisp air carried the faint scent of blooming flowers, mingling with the earthy aroma of dew-kissed cobblestones. It had been weeks since she last ventured out, her recovery from a lingering illness keeping her confined indoors. Each step felt like a small triumph, reconnecting her with the world she'd missed so dearly. As she approached her favorite cafe, nestled on the corner of a quiet street, her steps slowed. A familiar sense of comfort usually greeted her here, the warm chatter of patrons, the hum of the coffee grinder, the scent of freshly brewed espresso wafting through the air. But today, something was different. The cafe's windows were dark, and a handwritten sign hung on the door, closed. With a small, determined smile, she adjusted her scarf and looked around. Perhaps another cafe, she murmured to herself, her voice soft but resolute. The idea of discovering a new space to sit and enjoy her coffee, to feel the warmth of a cup between her hands and watch the world pass by, filled her with quiet excitement. She took a deep breath and continued down the street, the brisk morning air invigorating her. "Come on, keep going," Sofia whispered to herself, a faint but determined smile crossing her lips. The ache in her left leg, a stubborn reminder of arthritis complications, throbbed with every step. It tempted her to turn back, to retreat to the comfort of her home. But not today. Today, she refused to let the pain dictate her actions. She'd spent too many weeks indoors, staring out the window, longing for the streets she once walked so freely. With each careful step, she moved forward, her hand brushing lightly against a wrought iron railing as if to steady herself. The rhythmic sound of her shoes meeting the pavement echoed softly in the quiet morning air. The world around her seemed alive in its early spring charm, the faint rustling of budding leaves, the occasional chirp of a bird, and the low murmur of distant voices blending with the city's gentle hum. Something caught her attention, a rich, inviting aroma that seemed to envelop her like a warm embrace. It was the unmistakable scent of freshly brewed coffee, earthy and slightly sweet, mingled with the faint hint of baked pastries. Sofia paused, her heart lifting. She scanned the street and spotted a small cafe tucked between two narrow buildings, its modest sign swaying gently in the breeze. The cafe looked quaint and unassuming, with a single potted plant sitting outside its entrance and soft golden light spilling through the windows. For a moment, Sofia hesitated, her hand instinctively moving to her hip where the pain lingered. But the comforting scent of coffee was too enticing to resist. Taking a deep breath, she straightened herself and stepped forward, the promise of warmth and a moment of peace urging her on. As she pushed the door open, a soft bell above chimed, and she was greeted by the cozy hum of the cafe, the faint chatter of patrons, the hiss of the espresso machine, and the gentle strains of classical music filled the air. Sofia exhaled, a sense of calm washing over her. This, she thought, was exactly what she needed. Sofia chose a small table by the window, where the soft morning light spilled in, illuminating the wooden surface. It was the perfect spot, a place where she could quietly listen to the gentle classical music playing in the background and watch the world pass by on the bustling street outside. She carefully settled into her chair, adjusting her scarf and resting her cane against the table. Despite the lingering ache in her leg, she felt a flicker of contentment. Today will be a good morning, she thought to herself, allowing a small smile to cross her lips. As she glanced around, taking in the cozy ambience of the cafe, the warm yellow lights, the subtle hum of the espresso machine, and the soft murmur of nearby conversations, her peace was suddenly disrupted. She noticed the gaze of a man wearing the cafe's uniform. He appeared to be one of the servers, a tall figure with a stiff posture and a subtle scowl etched on his face. He stood near the counter, His arms crossed as he cast a scrutinizing look in Sofia's direction. His eyes scanned her from head to toe, pausing briefly on her modest coat and slightly worn scarf, before flicking away with a faint air of disinterest, or worse, disapproval. The judgment in his expression was subtle but unmistakable, as if he were silently evaluating her presence in the cozy cafe, deeming her somehow out of place. Sofia felt the weight of his gaze and shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her hand instinctively reaching for the handle of her cane. The flicker of contentment she had felt moments ago began to waver. She was no stranger to such looks, ones that spoke of silent assumptions and quiet dismissal. She exhaled softly, straightened her posture, and turned her gaze back to the street outside, pretending not to notice. Maybe it's nothing, she thought, trying to shake off the unease. But in her heart, she couldn't help but wonder why such moments, small as they seemed, still had the power to sting. Still, she decided not to let it ruin her morning. Let them think what they want, she told herself. After all, she hadn't come out today to seek anyone's approval. She'd come out to reclaim a part of herself. Sofia sat quietly, her hands folded neatly on the table, as she gazed out the window, trying to focus on the movement of the street rather than the unsettling feeling that lingered in the air. She could still feel the weight of the server's earlier gaze, but she pushed it aside, determined not to let it disrupt her moment of peace. However, her resolve was tested as the man, James, according to the small name tag pinned to his crisp uniform, began walking toward her, a menu in his hand. His steps were measured but carried an unmistakable stiffness, as though every stride brought him closer to a task he didn't particularly want to perform. The closer he got, the clearer it became that the look in his eyes wasn't one of warmth or welcome. It was something harder, colder, judgment laced with a faint trace of annoyance. His lips were pressed into a thin line, and the tightness in his jaw suggested he was bracing himself, or perhaps holding something back. When he finally reached her table, James placed the menu down with a bit more force than necessary. The faint thud seemed louder than it should have been in the serene cafe, breaking the gentle hum of music and conversation around them. He didn't offer the customary smile or pleasantries one might expect from a server. Instead, he stood there, his eyes scanning Sofia once more, as if silently questioning her presence in the cafe. "Here's the menu," he said flatly, his tone devoid of any friendliness. His eyes flicked briefly to her cane leaning against the table, then back to her face. "Do you need help with anything?" he added, the words sounding less like an offer of assistance and more like a thinly veiled challenge, as though daring her to ask for something out of place. Sofia looked up at him, her calm demeanor unshaken despite the edge in his voice. She could sense his disapproval, the way he seemed to silently measure her against some unspoken standard she clearly didn't meet. For a moment, she considered saying something, but instead, she simply nodded and picked up the menu, her fingers brushing over its leather cover. "No thank you," she replied softly, her tone polite but firm. "I'll let you know when I'm ready." James lingered for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly as if he expected her to stumble over her words or ask for something impractical. When she didn't, he gave a curt nod, turned on his heel, and walked away, leaving Sofia alone with the menu and the unsettling atmosphere he had brought with him. She let out a quiet breath, her fingers tightening slightly around the menu. Why does this always happen? She wondered, glancing out the window once more to calm herself. The peaceful morning she had envisioned seemed further away now. Sofia carefully opened the menu, her eyes scanning the elegant pages filled with beautifully written descriptions of gourmet coffee and pastries. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee lingered in the air, a stark contrast to the growing tension at her table. James, still standing nearby, crossed his arms loosely, his lips curling into a faint, almost mocking smirk. It seemed he had no intention of leaving quietly. Instead, he leaned slightly forward, his tone dripping with condescension. "You know," he began, his voice low but sharp enough for her to hear clearly, "I'm not sure you've come to the right place." He gestured subtly toward the window, where the park across the street was visible. "You look like you'd be more comfortable out there, sitting on one of those benches by the park, instead of here." Sofia paused, her hand resting lightly on the menu. Her expression remained calm, her polite demeanor unshaken by his words. She glanced up at him briefly, then back down to the menu, as if giving him a chance to stop himself. But James wasn't finished. "This isn't just some coffee stand. You know," he added, his tone now overly dismissive. "Everything here is high quality. It's not the kind of place where you can get a cheap cup of coffee and be on your way. So, if you're thinking about ordering, maybe you should consider whether or not it's within your budget." His words hung in the air like a challenge, the implied judgment in them unmistakable. Sofia looked up again, meeting his gaze for the first time since he started speaking. Her expression was calm, almost serene, but there was a quiet strength in her eyes that made James hesitate for just a moment. "I appreciate your concern," Sofia said softly, her voice measured and polite, yet carrying an undertone of grace that James hadn't expected. "But I assure you, I'm quite capable of deciding where I belong." James, still unwilling to let the matter go, leaned against the table with an air of feigned casualness, his smirk turning into something far more biting. His gaze dropped to Sofia's cane, then back to her face, his expression oozing disdain. He seemed to take pleasure in her calm, as if determined to shatter it with his words. "Quite the morning stroll for someone like you, isn't it?" he began, his tone laced with mockery. "That cane of yours must have seen some mileage today. You'd think someone in your condition would know better than to drag themselves all the way here." Sofia's grip on the menu tightened slightly, but she remained composed, refusing to give him the reaction he was so clearly fishing for. James, emboldened by her silence, pressed on. "I mean, really," he continued, his voice lowering as if to make his words more cutting. "What are you even doing here? A cafe like this? This isn't a place for someone who can barely walk or," he paused, glancing deliberately at her hands and then her face, "someone who doesn't exactly blend in with the crowd." The words hung in the air, venomous and cruel. A few patrons nearby exchanged uneasy glances, their discomfort evident, though none dared to step in. James, seeing that no one was stopping him, leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow felt even more threatening. "You know," he said, his smirk widening, "some people just don't know when they're out of place. Wouldn't it be easier for you to stay at home? Somewhere less public? Somewhere you wouldn't have to struggle to keep up?" Sofia's heart ached momentarily, not for herself, but for the bitterness that seemed to fuel his words. She'd faced prejudice before, the quiet kind and the blatant kind, and while it never got easier, she had learned not to let it break her. Instead, she slowly placed the menu down on the table and looked up at him with an expression of unwavering calm. "You seem to have a lot to say," she said softly, her voice steady despite the sharpness of his words. "And yet, nothing worth listening to." James blinked, momentarily thrown off by her response, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. He straightened up, crossing his arms and giving her another once-over. "I'm just saying what everyone else is probably thinking," he said, his tone defensive but still mocking. "This isn't exactly a place for charity cases or people like you. We have standards here." Sofia tilted her head slightly, her gaze steady. "And yet, here you are," she said evenly, her words cutting through his arrogance like a blade. "In all your judgments, in all your assumptions, you've only managed to show one thing about yourself. You lack the one quality that truly matters in a place like this: decency." James flinched at her words, his confidence beginning to falter. The quiet strength in her voice, combined with her refusal to lower herself to his level, seemed to catch him off guard. The nearby patrons, who had been watching silently, began to shift in their seats, their expressions changing from passive curiosity to quiet respect for Sofia's poise. "You may think you're better than me," Sofia continued, her voice soft but firm, "but let me tell you something. It costs nothing to be kind. However, you don't have anything." For a moment, James said nothing, his expression frozen as her words sank in. Around them, the cafe seemed to grow quieter, the weight of the exchange settling heavily over the room. James, visibly flustered, turned on his heel and walked back toward the counter. his earlier bravado now replaced with an uncomfortable stiffness. The patrons, still watching, exchanged knowing glances. James returned from the counter, balancing the tray with the teapot and pastry in one hand, his smirk now twisted with malice. He had made up his mind. This wasn't just about making Sofia uncomfortable anymore. He wanted to humiliate her, to show everyone in the cafe that she didn't belong in a place like this. As he walked toward her table, the quiet murmur of the cafe seemed to fade, and the tension grew with each step. Sofia sat peacefully by the window, her hands resting on the table, the sunlight highlighting the calmness in her expression. She glanced at James approaching but remained silent, her gaze returning briefly to the bustling street outside. Her composure, her refusal to react to his earlier insults, only fueled his determination. James reached her table and placed the tray down with a loud, deliberate thud, the sound echoing unnaturally in the otherwise serene cafe. The teapot wobbled precariously on the tray, and for a brief moment, it seemed as though he might lose control of it. Sofia noticed but said nothing, her calm demeanor only irritating him further. "Here we are," James said, his tone dripping with fake politeness. "One pot of tea and a pastry, as requested. Though, I must admit," he continued, his voice rising slightly so the nearby patrons could hear, "I can't help but wonder if this is all a bit much for you. Don't you think?" He lifted the teapot from the tray with an exaggerated flourish, pouring the tea into a delicate porcelain cup with just enough carelessness that the liquid splashed slightly onto the saucer. Then, as if by accident, but with precision that betrayed his intent, James tilted the teapot too far, sending a stream of hot tea spilling over the edge of the cup and onto Sofia's hand and lap. A collective gasp rippled through the cafe as the hot liquid soaked into Sofia's skirt. James feigned shock, stepping back with mock concern. "Oh no," he exclaimed, his voice oozing false sympathy. "I'm so sorry. I must have been distracted. Let me get something to clean that up." Sofia flinched slightly at the burning of the hot tea but quickly regained her composure, dabbing at her skirt with a napkin. Her calm demeanor, even in the face of such blatant disrespect, seemed to unsettle James more than he cared to admit. The room fell silent as everyone watched, waiting to see how she would respond. James, still holding the teapot, added with a smirk, "I suppose I should have been more careful, but then again, it's hard to stay focused when serving someone who looks so out of place here. Maybe next time, you'll reconsider whether this is the right place for you." The cruel remark, combined with the deliberate spill, drew murmurs of discomfort from some of the other patrons. A few exchanged glances, clearly appalled by James's behavior, but no one stepped in to intervene. James, sensing he still had the upper hand, stood smugly by, waiting for Sofia to lash out or retreat in shame. Quietly, from a hidden corner of the cafe, a man stepped into view, his long, purposeful strides carrying him quickly towards Sofia's table. The murmurs in the room hushed, and all eyes turned to the figure now approaching. His signature charisma and unmistakable presence filled the space like a quiet storm. And then it hit everyone. It was Johnny Depp. Sofia looked up, her calm gaze meeting his, a flicker of surprise crossing her face. In his hand was a smartphone, its screen still lit, and it became clear he had been recording everything that had just transpired. His expression was unreadable, serene but with a quiet intensity that hinted at the frustration he must have felt while witnessing the scene unfold. Johnny stopped just short of Sofia's table, his gaze briefly flickering to James, who had frozen behind the counter, his earlier arrogance now replaced by panic. The realization that someone as renowned as Johnny Depp had been silently watching and filming every word, every cruel act, was enough to drain the blood from James's face. Johnny turned back to Sofia, his voice calm but carrying a firmness that echoed through the now silent cafe. "Are you all right, ma'am?" he asked, his tone warm and genuine, with none of the condescension that had marked James's words. Sofia gave a small, graceful nod. "Yes, thank you," she replied softly, her composure intact despite the whirlwind of emotions in the room. Johnny looked at her for a moment, his expression softening, before turning his full attention to James. The shift in his demeanor was almost palpable. The calm kindness in his tone replaced with a quiet authority that filled the space. James, though visibly shaken for a moment, suddenly straightened his posture, his pride swelling as he glanced around the cafe. Standing behind the counter, in what he considered his domain, he seemed to regain some of his arrogance, his face hardening into a mask of indignation. He looked at Johnny, then at Sofia, and let out a sharp laugh that echoed uncomfortably through the quiet room. "You think you can just walk in here and humiliate me?" James said, his voice rising, attempting to command the attention of the room. "You don't know me. You don't know how things work here. This isn't some charity where just anyone gets to waltz in and expect special treatment." His gaze darted to Johnny, his expression twisting with a mix of defiance and contempt. "I don't care who you are or how many movies you've been in. This is my cafe, and I decide who belongs here and who doesn't." Gasps rippled through the room. Patrons exchanged uneasy glances, their shock at James's audacity now mixed with visible discomfort. Some shifted in their seats, while others looked at him with open disapproval. But James, emboldened by his own voice and the fact that no one immediately stopped him, leaned into his aggression. "These people," he gestured vaguely towards Sofia without even glancing at her, "think they can just sit here, pretending like they belong, wasting space meant for people who understand the value of places like this. This isn't some public park or diner. It's not for the likes of them." The venom in his words sent a chill through the room. Even those who had remained silent during his earlier antics now looked openly horrified. Johnny, who had been standing calmly, his phone still in hand, slowly stepped forward, his expression unreadable but carrying an air of restrained power. "Are you done?" Johnny asked quietly, his voice calm yet sharp enough to cut through the tension. His tone was controlled, but there was an unmistakable edge to it that made James falter for a split second. James hesitated, but his pride wouldn't allow him to back down. "I'm just telling it like it is," he said, his voice loud and defensive. "People like her don't belong here, and neither do outsiders who think they can walk in and play the hero." Johnny's expression didn't change, but the weight of his gaze seemed to press down on James. He took another step forward, his phone now lowered but still in his hand. The patrons watched in silence, their eyes flicking between the two men, the air in the room thick with anticipation. "You're right about one thing," Johnny said, his voice calm but carrying a weight that made James stiffen. "You don't know me, but let me tell you what I know about you." He paused, his gaze steady as he spoke with deliberate precision. "You're someone who confuses arrogance with authority, someone who thinks belittling others makes them powerful, someone who doesn't understand that respect is earned, not demanded." James opened his mouth to respond, but Johnny didn't give him the chance. "This isn't about status," Johnny continued, his voice growing firmer. "This is about humanity, and the fact that you're standing here, in front of everyone, trying to tear someone down instead of admitting you were wrong, that says everything anyone needs to know about you." The room fell silent again, the weight of Johnny's words pressing down like a heavy blanket. Even James, for all his bluster, seemed unsure of how to respond. His lips moved as if to form a retort, but no sound came out. Johnny turned his attention briefly to the other patrons, his voice softening but still firm. "We all have a choice," he said, addressing the room, "to stand by and let this kind of behavior continue, or to say enough is enough. Respect isn't a privilege, it's a right. And the moment we forget that, we lose what makes us human." The room erupted into murmurs of agreement. Some patrons nodded, while others gave James pointed looks of disapproval. James, now visibly cornered, clenched his fists at his sides, his face red with anger and humiliation. Johnny looked back at James one final time, his voice steady. "You think you're better than everyone else here, but all you've done is prove the opposite. Take a good look around, James, because if this is how you treat people, you won't have much of a cafe left to lord over." James stood frozen, his defiance crumbling under the collective judgment of the room. Even the barista behind the counter, who had been quietly watching, looked at him with a mixture of pity and disapproval. For the first time, James seemed to realize that he was alone in his arrogance. his supposed superiority laid bare for all to see. James, his pride bruised and his authority slipping away, refused to back down. His face flushed with a mix of anger and humiliation, and his jaw tightened as he took a step toward Johnny. The tension in the room thickened, and a hush fell over the cafe as patrons watched the scene unfold, their eyes wide with disbelief and unease. With his hand clenched into a fist, James raised his arm slightly, his body language signaling that he wasn't just going to let this confrontation end with words. His voice, loud and shaky, broke the silence. "You think you can come in here and talk to me like that? Who do you think you are?" he spat, his tone laced with anger. "This is my place, and I'm not about to let some washed-up actor and," he gestured towards Sofia with a sneer, "some old woman make a fool out of me." Gasps rippled through the cafe. Some patrons whispered nervously to one another, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure of whether to intervene. Johnny, however, didn't flinch. He remained seated, his gaze locked onto James with a calm intensity that seemed to magnify the tension in the room. James stepped closer, his arm still raised, as though he were daring Johnny to react. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue?" James taunted, his voice rising. "You think you can waltz in here and embarrass me in front of everyone? You think I'm just going to let that slide?" Johnny slowly stood from his chair, his movements measured and deliberate. His calm demeanor hadn't shifted, but there was a new edge to his presence, an aura of unshakable confidence that seemed to make James hesitate for a fraction of a second. "I don't think you understand what you're doing," Johnny said, his voice quiet but firm, each word slicing through the tension like a blade. "You've already humiliated yourself. No one here did that to you. You did it all on your own." James's fist tightened, but he stopped just short of making contact. The room was so quiet that the faint hum of the coffee machines could be heard in the background. Johnny took a step closer, his gaze steady and unyielding. "Let me give you some advice," Johnny continued, his tone unshaken. "Whatever you think you're proving right now, it's not strength, it's not power, it's desperation. And if you're smart, you'll stop before you make things worse for yourself." James faltered, his arm wavering slightly. The murmurs of the patrons grew louder, and some even began pulling out their phones, recording the confrontation as it escalated. The realization that he was being watched, that his actions were being documented, seemed to sink in. His face turned a deeper shade of red, but his arrogance refused to let him back down completely. "You don't scare me," James muttered, though his voice had lost its edge. "I'm not trying to scare you," Johnny replied, his voice calm but firm. "I'm trying to save you from yourself, because if you take another step, you're not just going to lose your pride, you're going to lose everything." As Johnny stood by Sofia's table, still holding his phone to his ear, the argument with James showed no signs of subsiding. The cafe remained tense, with patrons either watching nervously or whispering among themselves, unsure whether to intervene. James, emboldened by the lingering attention, still held onto his false sense of authority, his tone louder and more defiant with every word. "You think you can just call someone and get rid of me?" James scoffed, gesturing dramatically at Johnny. "This is my place when I'm here. I run things, I handle the customers, and I decide how things are done. If you don't like it, maybe you're the one who doesn't belong here." Johnny's calm demeanor barely faltered, though the edge in his voice grew sharper as he spoke into his phone. "You're going to want to get here quickly," he said to his friend on the line. "This guy is digging a hole so deep he's about to bury himself in it." On the other end of the call, Johnny's business partner, who had co-founded the cafe with him, sounded both alarmed and apologetic. "I'll call the manager right now," he said. "He was out getting supplies but should be close. He'll handle this. Just try to keep things from escalating until he gets there." Johnny ended the call and slipped his phone into his pocket, his gaze steady as he turned back to James. "You've got about 5 minutes to think about your next move," he said quietly, his tone steady but carrying a quiet authority that made James hesitate for the briefest moment. "I'd use them wisely if I were you." James laughed mockingly, though the sound came out forced and uneasy. "What's that supposed to mean? You think some phone call is going to scare me? I've been running this place for months. Dealing with customers like her, he jabbed a finger in Sofia's direction, his tone dripping with disdain. And people like you, who think they're better than everyone else? The room grew colder at his words. The quiet murmurs of the patrons now replaced with silence. Even the barista behind the counter, who had been nervously polishing glasses, froze mid-motion, her eyes wide with disbelief. Before Johnny could respond, the front door of the cafe swung open, and a man in his late 40s walked in, his arms loaded with paper bags filled with fresh ingredients. His face was slightly flushed from the cold outside, and there was a faint look of confusion on his face as he took in the unusual stillness of the cafe. This was Liam, the manager of the cafe and a trusted colleague of Johnny's business partner. He was well known for his professionalism and his sharp eye for detail. Liam's gaze swept the room, quickly landing on James, whose defensive posture and flushed face told him that something was very wrong. Then his eyes shifted to Johnny, and his confusion deepened for a moment before recognition dawned. "Mr. Depp?" Liam said, setting the bags down on the counter, his tone a mix of surprise and respect. "I wasn't aware you'd be visiting today." Johnny nodded politely, his expression calm but serious. "I wasn't planning on causing a scene, Liam, but your employee here," he gestured toward James, who was now glaring at him with barely concealed fury, "has made that impossible." Liam's brow furrowed as he looked between Johnny and James, then at Sofia, who sat quietly but with an unmistakable grace that only made the tension in the room more glaring. "What's going on here?" Liam asked, his voice firm. Before Johnny could explain, James jumped in, his voice loud and defensive. "This guy walks in here like he owns the place, starts sticking his nose where it doesn't belong, and tries to humiliate me in front of everyone. And her," he pointed again at Sofia, his tone laced with contempt. "She's just here to stir up trouble. I've been handling things, keeping order, and suddenly I'm the bad guy?" Liam's expression hardened, his sharp eyes narrowing as he processed James's words. He turned to Johnny, his voice quieter now. "Is that true, Mr. Depp?" Johnny tilted his head slightly, his calm gaze unwavering. "I think you know me well enough to know that's not how I operate, Liam," he said evenly. "But I can tell you what is true. I walked in here to have a quiet morning, only to find James mocking and humiliating a guest, deliberately spilling tea on her, and refusing to back down when confronted. He's been nothing but aggressive, disrespectful, and arrogant." Liam's face darkened as he turned back to James, who was now shifting uncomfortably under his manager's piercing gaze. "Is that so?" Liam asked, his voice low but filled with authority. James opened his mouth to respond, but the words died on his tongue as Liam raised a hand. "Don't," Liam said sharply. "I don't want excuses. I want the truth." The room was silent as James looked around, his earlier bravado quickly crumbling under the weight of Liam's authority and the judgmental stares of the patrons. "I was just trying to keep things under control," he stammered. She didn't belong here. And he started interfering. Liam's expression turned steely. "Your job isn't to decide who belongs here, James," he said coldly. "Your job is to ensure every guest feels welcome and respected, no matter who they are. And from what I've heard, and what I can see, you failed miserably." James's face turned pale as Liam gestured toward the door. "You're done," Liam said firmly. "Get your things and leave. I'll deal with the paperwork later." James hesitated, looking as though he might argue, but the look in Liam's eyes silenced him. Without another word, James turned and walked toward the back, his steps heavy and reluctant. The cafe remained silent until the sound of the back door closing echoed through the room. Liam turned back to Johnny and Sofia, his face filled with regret. "Mr. Depp." "Ma'am," he said, his tone sincere. "I can't begin to apologize for what's happened here today. I take full responsibility for James's behavior, and I'll ensure nothing like this ever happens again." Johnny nodded, his expression softening slightly. "Thank you, Liam. That's all I wanted, to make sure this place stays true to what it's meant to be." Sofia smiled gently, lifting her teacup in a small gesture of gratitude. "Thank you," she said quietly. "It's good to know that kindness still has a place in the world." The tension in the room finally lifted, and as Liam began addressing the remaining staff, Johnny sat back down across from Sofia, the cafe returning to a semblance of normalcy. But for everyone who had witnessed the events of that morning, it was clear that the cafe and the people in it had been irrevocably changed. As Johnny helped Sofia to her feet and handed her the cane she leaned on for support, a flicker of memory crossed his mind. He remembered his mother, Betty Sue Palmer, her strong hands worn from years of hard work, and the quiet dignity she carried despite the many struggles life had thrown her way. She had spent years as a waitress in small diners, enduring judgment and prejudice from customers who saw her as little more than the uniform she wore. It had left a mark on Johnny, shaping his understanding of the quiet strength it took to rise above that kind of treatment. The fresh spring air greeted them as they stepped outside, the streets bustling with life. As they began their walk through the neighborhood, Johnny's thoughts drifted back to his mother. He remembered the evenings she would come home exhausted, her hands red from washing dishes and serving meals all day, but she never let her children see her pain. He remembered her telling him about the cruel remarks customers would sometimes make, comments about her appearance, her accent, her background, and yet she would shrug them off with a strength that both inspired and saddened him. Sofia's soft voice brought him back to the present. "You didn't have to step in back there," she said, glancing at him with a mixture of gratitude and curiosity. "But you did. Most people would have just watched." Johnny turned to her, his expression calm but tinged with something deeper, a quiet empathy born from years of witnessing his mother's silent battles. "Most people don't realize how much their silence can hurt," he said. "I've seen what it does to someone. My mom used to be a waitress, and she dealt with people like that every day. People who thought they were better than her just because of what she did for a living." Sofia listened intently, her gaze softening as Johnny continued. "She always carried herself with so much grace, even when people treated her like she didn't matter. It stayed with me, seeing how hard she worked and how little respect she got from some people. I promised myself a long time ago that I wouldn't let people get away with that kind of cruelty, not if I could help it." Sofia nodded, her grip on his arm tightening slightly as she steadied herself. "She must have been a remarkable woman," she said quietly. "She was," Johnny replied, his voice filled with warmth and a tinge of sadness. "And she taught me that kindness isn't about who you are or what you have, it's about what you give to the people around you." As they walked, Johnny couldn't help but notice how Sofia reminded him of his mother in some ways. Her quiet strength, her refusal to let the bitterness of others diminish her dignity. It was something he'd seen in Betty Sue many times. It only reinforced his determination to make sure Sofia left this day feeling valued and respected, not diminished by the cruelty of others. When they reached Sofia's building, Johnny paused at the steps, glancing up at the modest but well-kept structure. He turned to her with a small smile. "Here we are," he said gently. "Can I help you inside?" Sofia shook her head, returning his smile with one of her own. "You've done more than enough," she said softly, her voice filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Johnny, for everything." Johnny hesitated for a moment before reaching into his pocket and pulling out a small card with the cafe's name and contact information. "If you ever need anything, or if you feel like stopping by the cafe again, just call. You'll always be welcome." Sofia took the card, her fingers brushing against it as though it were something precious. She looked up at him, her eyes glistening slightly. "You've reminded me that not everything in this world is bad," she said softly. "There are still good people. Today, I was lucky enough to meet one of them." Johnny smiled, tipping an imaginary hat in a playful gesture, his tone light but sincere. "The pleasure was mine, ma'am," he said with a wink. "Take care of yourself." As Sofia climbed the steps to her building, Johnny stood for a moment, watching her. The weight of his mother's memory and the events of the day settled in his chest. He had done what she would have wanted him to do, what she had always taught him to do: stand up for those who couldn't, and remind the world that kindness and respect were not just choices, but necessities. Walking away, Johnny couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of peace. The morning had started with tension and cruelty, but it had ended with something far more important: a reminder of the power of empathy, and the realization that, Despite the darkness the world often carried, there was still light to be found in simple acts of decency. The afternoon sunlight poured through the lace curtains of Sofia's modest but cozy living room, casting warm patterns on the wooden floor. She sat in her favorite armchair, a soft knitted shawl draped over her shoulders. Across from her, her teenage grandson, Ethan, lounged on the couch, his hands busy scrolling through his phone. It had become a regular part of their afternoons, him visiting after school, her telling stories of the past, or offering gentle advice. But today was different. Today, Sofia had a story she knew Ethan needed to hear. "Ethan," Sofia began, her voice soft but steady. "Put that phone down for a moment. I have something to tell you." Ethan glanced up, a little reluctant at first, but the expression on his grandmother's face intrigued him. There was a warmth in her eyes, but also a quiet intensity, as though the story she was about to share carried weight. He set the phone down on the table and leaned back, giving her his full attention. "You know," she started, folding her hands neatly in her lap, "I wasn't planning on going out today. I've been feeling a little fragile lately, what with my arthritis acting up and recovering from that nasty cold. But the weather was so lovely this morning, and I thought to myself, why not enjoy the sunshine? So, I went out to my favorite cafe." Ethan nodded, already familiar with her fondness for her usual coffee spot. "That's good. Grandma, did you get your tea and pastry?" Sofia smiled faintly but shook her head. "Not at that cafe. No. When I got there, I found it closed for the day. That was disappointing, but I decided not to let it ruin my morning. I kept walking and found another cafe a little farther down the street." "That's great," Ethan said, leaning forward slightly. "Did you like it?" Sofia's smile faded slightly as she exhaled. "It wasn't quite what I expected," she admitted. "You see, when I walked in, it felt like the place didn't want me there. The server, his name was James, looked at me as if I didn't belong. He judged me." "Ethan, from the moment I stepped inside." Ethan frowned, his brows furrowing. "What do you mean? What did he do?" "He looked at me as though I were out of place," Sofia said, her voice calm but tinged with the memory of the hurt. "He made comments about how I was dressed, about my cane, even suggested I should be sitting on a park bench instead of in a cafe like that. And when he brought my tea, he deliberately spilled it on me, trying to humiliate me in front of everyone." Ethan sat up straight, his face a mix of shock and anger. "What? He did that? Why didn't someone stop him?" Sofia gave a small shrug. "At first, no one said a word. They all just watched, some pretending not to notice, others whispering among themselves. It was as though they were more interested in the drama than in doing what was right." Ethan shook his head, his voice rising with indignation. "That's horrible. What did you do? Did you say something to him?" Sofia smiled softly at her grandson's fierce protectiveness. "I stayed calm. Ethan, I've learned over the years that reacting to cruelty with anger only gives it more power." I answered him politely, firmly, and refused to let his words or actions diminish me. But then something remarkable happened. Ethan leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. "What happened?" Sofia's smile widened slightly, a spark of warmth returning to her expression. From a corner of the cafe, a man stood up and walked over. At first, I didn't realize who he was, but when he got closer, I recognized him. It was Johnny Depp. Ethan's eyes widened in disbelief. "Johnny Depp? Johnny Depp?" Sofia nodded, her expression calm but her tone carrying the excitement of the moment. "Yes, that Johnny Depp. He had been sitting quietly, watching everything unfold, and when he saw how James was treating me, he couldn't stay silent. He stepped in, stood up for me, and let James know in no uncertain terms that what he was doing was wrong." Ethan's mouth fell open slightly. "That's incredible. What did he say?" Sofia recounted Johnny's calm yet powerful words, how he called out James for his cruelty and reminded everyone in the cafe that respect and kindness were basic human decencies. He spoke with such authority. "Ethan," Sofia said, her voice tinged with admiration. "But it wasn't just his words, it was his actions. He stayed by my side, made sure I was okay, and didn't leave until everything was resolved. Ethan shook his head in amazement. I can't believe that happened. He sounds like a really good person. He is, Sofia said softly. And he reminded me of something I had almost forgotten, that not everything in this world is cruel or indifferent. There are still people who care, who are willing to stand up for what's right. Ethan sat quietly for a moment, processing his grandmother's story. Finally, he looked at her and asked, "How did it feel? I mean, having someone like that stand up for you?" Sofia's smile turned wistful. "It felt hopeful," she said after a pause. "It reminded me that even in the face of unkindness, there's always the possibility of goodness. And that's what I want you to remember. Ethan, no matter how harsh the world may seem at times, there are still people out there who will do the right thing, and you can be one of them." Ethan nodded slowly, her words sinking in. "I will, Grandma. I promise." Sofia reached out and placed a hand on his, her touch gentle but firm. "Good," she said, "because the world needs more kindness, Ethan, and it starts with people like you." The two of them sat in silence for a moment, the warmth of the afternoon sunlight wrapping around them like a comforting embrace. For Sofia, the morning's events had been a powerful reminder of the resilience of kindness. And for Ethan, it was a story he would carry with him, a reminder that even in a world that could sometimes feel dark, there was always light to be found in the actions of good people. As Sofia finished her story, the warmth of her words filled the room, leaving Ethan deep in thought. He pictured the scene she had described, the injustice, the courage, and the quiet power of Johnny stepping up for her. But what struck him most was how one act of kindness could ripple outward. "Grandma," Ethan asked thoughtfully, "do you think the people in the cafe learned something from what happened? Seeing him stand up for you like that?" Sofia nodded gently. "I believe they did," she replied. "I saw it in their faces. At first, many were silent, unsure whether to intervene. But as Johnny spoke, something changed. Some looked ashamed, realizing their silence had been a choice. Others seemed inspired, reminded that they, too, could stand up for what's right." Ethan leaned forward. "So kindness can spread, like a chain reaction?" "Exactly," Sofia said, smiling. "It's not just the act itself, it's the example it sets. When someone sees kindness in action, it plants a seed, reminding them of their own ability to be compassionate and brave." Inspired, Ethan promised to share her story. Over the following days, he told friends and shared it online. The story resonated with many. Comments poured in from people who were moved by Johnny's actions and Sofia's strength. One cafe patron even admitted they felt ashamed for not intervening but vowed to act differently in the future. A service worker shared how the story reminded them to treat everyone with dignity, no matter their appearance. As Sofia and Ethan read the responses, her heart swelled. "See, Ethan," she said, "kindness is like a stone dropped in water. The ripple spread farther than we imagine. And it all started because one person chose to do the right thing." Ethan nodded, pride shining in his eyes. "I'll remember that, Grandma. I'll make sure to be one of those people, too." Sofia smiled, knowing her story had sparked something greater. Through her experience, she saw how even a small act of kindness could make the world a little brighter, one ripple at a time. Sofia smiled, knowing her story had sparked something greater. Through her experience, she saw how even a small act of kindness could make the world a little brighter, one ripple at a time. She looked at Ethan and added, "And remember, Ethan, even the smallest act of kindness can change someone's day or even their life." Ethan reached over to hold her hand, his eyes full of determination. "I won't forget, Grandma. I promise." Love this content? Like the video and subscribe for more amazing updates. Share your thoughts below. Your support means to us.